Just then the maiden said, "Do cast your eyes into the sea." When they focused on the waves of the sea, it was as if people were truly there, and as if bulls were bellowing also, and oxen too. And a distant black mass constantly went backward and forward until it again departed and disappeared over the horizon. This quote from 1856 describes a vision experienced with a Xhosa prophetess in South Africa and preceded one of the most terrible events of the colonial period, the Great Xhosa Cattle Killings of 1856 to 1857. The story itself is tragic, but there's certainly no shortage of tragic stories connected with colonialism. What makes this event stand out, and what makes us focus on it today in this episode of History, she wrote, is how it is echoed through to current events. Nonkuuse was an orphan who was living with her uncle Mshakaza. Her parents had been killed in the frontier wars between the British and the Xhosa, and it's important to note that her uncle Mshakaza had lived with missionaries for several years and evangelized many Xhosa while doing so. Mshakaza no longer practiced the Christian faith, but he had created his own sort of traditional pagan hybrid, and he became the conduit through which Nonkuuse's visions were interpreted. In April 1856, Nonkuuse came back from tending the fields and reported that she had met her dead ancestors, and they had given her several directives. First, all cattle that were held by the Xhosa must be slaughtered. Second, all cultivation of crops must cease and new grain would need to be found for planting. Third, old dwellings should be brought down, and new dwellings and cattle enclosures should be built. And fourth, that witchcraft, incest, and idolatry should be totally abandoned. Were all these things done, the dead would rise, and a mighty wind would sweep all the Europeans into the sea, and new and healthy cattle and grain would be provided to the Xhosa. And shocking to many of us, with modern and comfortable sensibilities, most of the Xhosa were actually on board with her prophecy. The king himself made a trip to see her and was convinced of her powers, ordering those in his villages to begin the slaughter. It was the beginning of a movement that led to more than 300,000 cattle killed, more than 40,000 Xhosa dead of starvation, and the full subjugation of the Xhosa nation under the British colonizer. Nonkuuse was an orphan. Mixed into all of this is yet one more seemingly strange morsel of information, that Nonkuuse and those who followed her prophecies believed it was the Russian army who were coming to save them. Now, that seems like a crazy factoid out of nowhere, but it makes perfect sense when the situation as a whole is actually understood. On the military front, the Xhosa, who are a proud and powerful people, had been thoroughly defeated and humiliated during the frontier wars with the British. The wars had become devoid of humanity. The customs of each side seemed to be completely foreign and disrespectful to the other, and they were causing more and more and more dehumanization. For instance, Xhosa custom was to rip the bellies of the dead opponents to prevent their spirits from taking revenge in the afterlife. They even went so far as to dig up the graves of soldiers they discovered. The British response to what they viewed as desecration of the dead was increasingly harsh, and they began hanging dead Xhosa from the trees in what they viewed as a warning. The Xhosa would use the skulls of their enemies in their war magic. But the British as well would take the skulls of Xhosa, boil the skin off, and send them back to Britain as collector's items. There's no such thing as a good war, but this was war at its absolute worst and most inhumane. When the British won, some of the commanders piled insults further, demanding that the Xhosa chiefs kiss their boots, for instance. And at another time, a leading Xhosa chief was given safe conduct to a meeting and then imprisoned and killed. Plans were drawn up to deprive the Xhosa of their most valued assets, their cattle, which included things like outlawing lobola, which is bride price, and shooting any cattle which were reportedly a part of a civil dispute, rather than, mediating the dispute. Nor were the frontier wars the only thing the Xhosa were contending with at the time. In 1850, a devastating drought hit the Xhosa lands. Then, brought by imported Dutch cattle, lung sickness began to infect their herds. Cattle were dying horribly, and the Xhosa were powerless to do anything about it. And, as if all that weren't enough, a grub began attacking the planted crops of the Xhosa as well. As stated by Jeff Piaris, author of The Dead Will Arise, Nonkuuse and the Great Xhosa Cattle Killing movement of 1856-57, the Xhosa cattle killing movement tapped a deep-seated emotional and spiritual malaise resulting from material deprivation and military defeat. Simply put, the Xhosa were desperate to save their people. But South Africa, remote as it was in 1856, did not exist in a vacuum. Years before Nonkuuse's prophecy, the rumblings of the Crimean War had reached the ears of the Xhosa. This intercontinental and intercultural game of telephone had imparted only the most important news. The hated former governor George Cathcart had been killed by the Russians. Someone was strong enough to kill the British, and that someone could save the Xhosa. Now, the Xhosa had no idea who the Russians actually were or what they looked like. The British, they asked, told them that the Russians had white skin, just as the British did. But this made no sense to the Xhosa, who began to develop a national mythos in regards to the Russian army. To the Xhosa, the Russians, who were enemies of the hated British, could only be black. And it was obvious that they were the spirits of dead Xhosa warriors. More lore was added to their view of the Russians, and it was said that the army was led by a Xhosa prophet who had drowned off Robben Island. Even before Nonkuuse's prophecies, lookouts were often sent to check the sea for the incoming Russian military ships that were supposed to be coming to save the Xhosa. It needs to be said here that if it seems the Xhosa were grasping at anything, the truth is that they were. Here was one of the most powerful people in southern Africa, and they had been brought to their lowest depths of humiliation by the British. The natural occurrences of drought, pestilence, and the imported lung disease made it seem as though the entirety of the world, natural and unnatural, human and deity, were aligned against the Xhosa. At this point in their history, the Xhosa understood they could not save themselves. They needed an explanation for why they had been so defeated, and they needed a savior. Nonkuuse's prophecies offered them both. The Xhosa hardships had been brought about by bad behavior. That behavior needed to be corrected. And saviors, in the form of the Russian army, would come to usher them back into prosperity. Their defeat was not lasting. They only needed to believe. Cattle were slaughtered, crops were abandoned and burned. Families fought within themselves as some argued against following the slaughter movement. Dates came and went, and still the Xhosa were under the heel of the Europeans. The non-appearance of the Russian army was blame on the Amagogya, the non-believers who did not slaughter their cattle. And one final push of cattle killing took place to rectify this issue. The final day dawned. As one Xhosa later recorded, "I sat outside my hut and saw the sun rise. So did all the people. We watched until midday, yet the sun continued on its course. We still watched until the afternoon, and yet it did not return. And the people began to disappear because they saw this thing was not true." The Russian army did not come. The Xhosa, deprived of property, dying of starvation, were defeated. It was done. In today's world, Russia is one of the big players in Africa. There are many reasons for this, but one holds true today as it did to Nonkouse in 1856. The Russians aren't the hated former colonials, so they can be trusted. We know how this played out in 1856, but perhaps the world in 2023 is a vastly different place. Thank you for joining me in today's episode of History She Wrote, where we follow the threads of history into the present. Remember, the story of today is written on the paper created by the past. And for goodness sake, make sure you can find all these places on a map.